So this whole class we've been talking about global theology, and we're covering different angles of global theology. What does it mean that the church is in so many countries now, and that the church is even stronger in other parts of the world than it is in the traditional Christian countries? And one aspect of global theology is global mission. And so in times past, the majority of missionaries were coming from the West, from Europe and from America. And I think as time has gone on, we have seen the shift, and we're going to see the shift continue. And so first off, I want to start with some terminology. When we think of other countries, a very common term that has been used is third world. And so we'll talk about third world countries. The idea was that Europe was the first world, the USA was the second world, and then everywhere else is just the third world. Then later people said, well, it's really the two-thirds world because two-thirds of the people in the world live in that part of the world. And then somebody took that and just said majority world, but a term that a lot of people are using right now is global south. And so we talked about the shift of Christianity from Israel, from Jerusalem specifically, and then out from there. And so it kind of went north and west up into Europe, and then it went further west, and now the trend is it is heading south, and it is heading back towards the east. And so the majority of the churches in the world today are in the global south. And so that's going to be the term that I use, will either be majority world or global south. So very, very quickly, the history of missions looks like these 5 phases. So you have the time of Christ to AD 500. This is what one historian calls the first 5 centuries. Then there's the 1,000 years of uncertainty. The different groups started persecuting Christians quite severely. Things like Fox's Book of Martyrs and other things came out of this time period. And so it was very uncertain if the Christian movement was actually going to survive at all. Obviously it has, because we're all here today. There's 3 centuries of advance, which leads into the Great Century. The Great Century, to use the terminology we've been using in class, this speaks of the colonial era. And so we have colonialism, we have post-colonialism, and now we have whatever this new era is going to be. And so the Great Century, you have colonial powers going throughout the world, kind of taking over regions politically, and then you have missionaries coming in behind and kind of Christianizing behind the political powers. The world has radically changed. We talked a lot about this in the first segment, where all of these formerly colonized countries, these formerly Christianized countries, reverted to local power. And because of this, there has been kind of a destabilizing of the Western world. The power structure that it had is much less than it used to have. And that goes up till now. So as we think about, kind of the way that the world has changed, it's really pretty significant. So basically, in the colonial era, this is how the structure looked like in terms of missions. So you have what we would call the missio Dei. So translated, that means the mission of God, but we would say that the missio Dei is not just the mission of God, but it is part of his nature. So the missio Dei is not just the mission of God. We would say by virtue that there is only one God, by virtue that he created the world when he did not have to create the world, this means that he is Lord and God over everything. But this has been presented wrapped in the bubble of Western Christendom. And so again, missionaries took the gospel, but they also took European and American culture to the places that they went. And so because of this, the global South church and mission has always been, so you have this downward arrow. So this is to try to imply there's a kind of subordinate relationship. And so who ran the churches back in the colonial era? The European missionaries, or the American missionaries for that matter. And so there's the small little red arrow going back. And so they relate to the missio Dei essentially through the missionaries and through Western Christendom. So later in kind of post-colonial era, the missio Dei and Western Christendom were kind of separated. But but there's still a bit of a prioritization. There's still a bit of, well, we're not your parent anymore, but now we're just your big brother. And so in general, there seem to be equal parts of relation to the Missio Dei by way of Western Christendom and just directly. But you can see this is a positive move. It's not all one directional and all through Western Christendom. Now there is at least this other avenue. And so from this time, there have been some developing trends. And so one is the emergence of Christianity. At the time of colonialism and colonialism and right at post-colonialism, 83% of the world, 83% of the Christians lived in North America and Europe. Okay, think about that. The majority of Christians lived in two continents, whereas today 60% live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so there has been this increased population of Christians throughout the world, but that also shifts the balance of power, so to speak, just in terms of from a numbers standpoint, from a population standpoint. And so the emergence of Christianity throughout many, many other areas of the world where formerly it was not known is now known. So that you can go to the place where you think, oh, that's the most anti-Christian country, and you will find believers there, you will find churches there. The next thing is the world has globalized. We are very interconnected. This often happened through business, technology, then information, but now the flows of people, we're very interconnected. Later on in the course, we're going to have a night where we talk about diaspora missiology. What is God doing with all of the people that have been dispersed from their home countries? And then finally, you have a globalized church. So the church has gone all over the world. Drive around Alief, drive around Southwest Houston, drive other parts of Houston, and you'll see, the Indonesian Baptist Church and Filipino Lutheran Church and a Taiwanese, Pentecostal Church for Left-Handed Fishermen. We have all of these different denominations from the West that have now gone around the world and are now coming back. And so the church itself has been globalized. And so what does it look like today then? And I would say this is what I've been calling the partnership era or the brotherhood era. This looks like the Missio Dei, God's mission, is above both of us, both Western Christendom and the global South. And we each have a direct mandate. I would say biblically it's always been this way, but now we're just practically seeing this played out in large part. And then now we see partnership between Western Christendom and the global South, which I would say is healthy and necessary. So this has been a radical shift from the Missio Dei completely encased by Western languages and worship forms and music forms and languages and building styles and everything to the day where now the global church is sending its own missionaries throughout the world. So here's a list of missionaries sent by country, sent and received. So the United States is still at the top of that list. We send 127,000. Brazil is number 2. South Korea is number 3. India is number 9. So some of these countries are your typical, Euro-American countries. But again, look at Brazil and South Korea. They make up number 2 and 3. And so this is no longer just the West to the rest. This is the gospel from everywhere to everywhere. And that's what we want to see. I would say this is the best and clearest picture of what God is doing in the world, the idea of Him being a global God. This is the best reflection of that. Look at the top receivers. I was surprised when I found the statistic today. The United States is at the top of the receiving list, which, we need it. So I'm glad. But top receivers are Brazil, Russia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Africa, France, the UK, Argentina, Chile, India. So this is a very interesting list to think about, what are the countries that are sending? Now, part of the issue is not every country, their sending agency is well known. And so as I've been trying to find who is sending what missionaries and all of that, sometimes this data is not on websites, and so for Westerners, if it's not on a website, it's not real. But the data is out there, and so I want to kind of go in broad strokes. I found a study that talks a lot about the church and mission sending in different areas. And so with each of these, we'll talk about the growth and the strength and the challenges from each region. So with Latin America, I might not read through all of these, but growth is seen as a movement of God with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Number 2 and 3 speak to the issue of holism. So the idea that we shouldn't just preach the gospel by itself, but that we should speak to the whole person, to the whole situation. And so the church, as it is now beginning to answer this question of what do we do about issues like poverty and crime, is also becoming more and more relevant in society in Latin America. Number 4, they see that they are reaping what has been sown for hundreds of years now in Latin America. So we look at other regions of the world that are not very receptive to the gospel, and we often don't have a long-standing history in those places, we being Christians. And so as Latin America, the church is growing and growing and growing, it's on the back of hundreds of years of presentation of the gospel that now is bearing fruit. They see, number 5, indigenous leadership in the church is growing, whereas before, leadership was from outsiders. And then finally, number 7, they see that it's just time to participate. And so the Latin American church is starting to send missionaries abroad. Some of the challenges is that the measure of success has been established as simply a numerical standard. Oftentimes the leadership and the church structures or denominational structures are not prepared for the growth that they are receiving. Last semester, we did a class on animism, and quite a few of our speakers were from South America. And so number 3, the third challenge is animism and spiritism are growing even in some Christian churches. So animism is one of those things where you mix it in with Catholicism, or you mix it in with being evangelical, or you mix it in with whatever religion. And so it's not two clear, distinct categories. It's just this melding of worlds. Materialism, postmodernism, many of the things that we are struggling with in the North and in the West are things that are beginning to take effect in cities via education, via media and other things. There's a lack of training among leadership. You're going to see this be one of the challenges that is very, very common across the board. As our church has talked about going and doing leader training in other countries, that's one of the challenges, is how do we give them resources to help them study and help them grow while we're not there the other 51 weeks a year. And it's hard because there's not that much stuff that has been translated. Here we're just talking Spanish and Portuguese. I guess there's a lot of tribal languages, but even just Spanish and Portuguese, there's not many resources that have been translated that we are aware of. And then there's this need for discipleship. So there's lots of believers, lots of converts, but not many people that are willing to live like that Monday through Saturday. And so now I want to talk about a couple of Latin American networks. There's one called COMIBAM, which loosely stands for the Cooperation of Missionaries from Iberia and America. So Iberia would be Spain and Portugal, and then Latin America. So there's 26 nations currently cooperating together that are from the Americas, from Spain and Portugal. This was formed in 1987, and at that time there were 1,600 church planters from 70 agencies. So 1987, there's 1,600 church planters from 70 agencies. In 2006, as a result of COMIBAM's work, there are 10,000 church planters from 400 different organizations in Latin America. And so they have been instrumental in helping organize and train and lead the Latin American church cross-denominationally, cross organizations into fruitfulness and into sending church planters. Brazil deserves its own mention just because they're the largest and most populous country in Latin America. They also are they're not Spanish speakers, they speak Portuguese. As an individual group, they send out about 1/3 of all missionaries from Latin America. And from that other slide, they're number 2 in the world in terms of how many they send out total. So let's look at Africa then. The growth and strength in Africa is a result from prayerfulness in the church, dynamic presence of the Holy Spirit, powerful preaching, wonders and miracles. They have large church attendance and a lot of interest from young people. And they would say there's generous giving. So all 3 of these regional studies are from one paper, which was from this global conference that had a lot of leaders from these areas. So this is a list that they are providing for us. And so some of the challenges is that a lot of the pastors are without adequate training. Again, we're going to see this be a common thing throughout the world. Church leaders lack the administrative skills to keep up with the growth that they are seeing. Sometimes there's a lack of missionary vision or kingdom perspective, a lack of true godly leaders, and a lack of true success. And so those are the challenges that they are facing in Africa in terms of mission development. Now let's look at some African networks. These first 2 right here, Capro and Mani, both of these have done conferences in Houston in the past 2 weekends. And so myself and a couple others from church have been able to attend both of those, and we've met some of the leaders. The leader of Capro USA actually visited the church a couple Sundays ago, which was nice to have him here. So Capro sends out about 700 missionaries from 26 different countries, and they are operating in 35 different countries throughout the world. One of the conversations that I've had with the Capro leadership is that they have been invited to Colombia, and they don't have any experience with Colombians. And so every time I go to a conference, I promote the idea that Houston should be a training and sending and connecting base to send people throughout the world. And he heard this idea just casually over lunch at that conference, and he said, hey, let's go to lunch, I want to talk about this idea. And so he wants to send some of their Nigerian missionaries to Houston, possibly to Wilcrest, to get connected to people from Colombia or people with ties to Colombia or experience with Spanish and Latin American culture, and then be sent out. And so what a great picture of how our church, being, as we talk about this multi-ethnic bridge, can be instrumental in inviting people into our city, equipping them, and then sending them out through our connections. Mani is similar to Capro. It's a network that joins churches and agencies from 49 African countries. I didn't count up all the countries in Africa, but I think that's all of them. And so, again, they are sending people throughout the world. You have NEMA. Those first 3 are all Nigerian-based, by the way. There are about 90 agencies, and they send out about 3,800 missionaries in 38 nations. And then there's finally this last one, Mission Center in the Heart of Africa. This is based in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. They've trained about 800 pastors from 75 denominations. So they're more focused on the what they call the heart of Africa, the center part. And then finally, we have Asia. So its growth and strength comes from the fact that it is a young continent if you compare its median age to other places. So a lot of the church growth then is related to young people, which is good. Church and mission are growing in some parts of Asia, such as India and Korea, even China. There's freedom in some parts of Asia to evangelize those who cannot be reached in other countries. We'll talk more about this on the day where we talk about diaspora missions. So basically, the point that they're making there is that as people move around from one country to another for work or for whatever, they might be from a closed country, and then they go somewhere for work where they're able to have access to the gospel and able to go to church and read the Bible without any suspicion. There's a lot of Indian national missions now that are being very effective in India, and even in places like northern India, which tend to be more Muslim. There are some people that are even having effectiveness there. India, Japan, and Korea have been moving towards an economic ability to send missionaries. This is one of the challenges that all of these different groups face, is how do we send our own missionaries, because it takes money. And so they answer it in a number of ways, but for the church in India, Japan, and Korea, they are actually beginning to have the financial capacity to send their own missionaries. And number 7, there's a lot of opportunities in the Middle East countries for non-intentional missionaries or creative access missionaries from India and Filipino Christians as well. And so a lot of them are going throughout the world with their job. And so they might be an engineer, or they might be a construction worker of some kind, or a nurse or a teacher. And they're able to just go throughout the world. The challenge is that the largest religious blocs in Asia are Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. And so these are 3 groups that tend to not be interested in Christianity. The 3 largest Muslim communities are also in Asia. That's Indonesia, Pakistan, and India. I think last week I gave you the statistic that only 10%, that 1 in 10 Muslims in the world is Indian, but only 10% of India is Muslim. And so that speaks to both their size and diversity. There's a growing cultural nationalism connected with religion in some of the Asian countries. So Tony shared about some of the nationalistic movements that are happening in India to promote Hinduism at the expense of the other religions. And so there's a growing anti-Christian and anti-Muslim sentiment there. But the church is also struggling in places like Japan and Thailand. And so these are places with a very strong cultural identity, a strong religious identity that tends to be very, very resistant to outside ideas and religions in particular. And number 6, Hindu sections of Asia are very resistant to evangelism, and people have little interest in Christ. So those are the challenges. Let's look at the networks. In China, there's a movement there called Back to Jerusalem. And so the Great Commission says, take the gospel to the ends of the world. And the Chinese Christians say, hey, we're at the end of the world from this side of it. And so their idea is now to take the gospel back across the Silk Road and to evangelize as they go, all the way back to Jerusalem. When you think about it, the Americas are the other end of the world. And so perhaps we should be doing the same thing. In India, there are lots and lots of Christians. The India Missions Association has about 250 churches and organizations involved in sending missionaries. Every conference I go to, I wind up meeting Indian pastors who are training other pastors who are training other pastors. And so that kind of pastor training model seems to be taking hold among some of the mission movements there. There's a guy named K.P. Yohanan who has started a group called Gospel for Asia. And part of what he does is he tries to get Western Christians to financially support Indian pastors. And their idea is that look at how much money it would take to send an American family over, the kind of house that they would expect to live in, the kind of amenities that they're used to, versus Indians that are just, this is just life for us and this is how we live, and the cost is much cheaper. And so he's doing that there. Finally, Korea. They were number 3 on the list of sending out missionaries. They send out about 27,000 missionaries throughout the world. Any global missions conference you go to or any international missions team you meet is always going to have Brazilians and Koreans on it. They're everywhere throughout the world. And so the Korean World Mission Association is the association that sends out most of those missionaries. There's also something called the Yoido Full Gospel Church. The largest church in the world, most people don't know this, is actually in Korea. And he has about 250,000 members in cell groups. 250, what did you say, better than Joel Osteen? Yeah. How do you say your best life now in Korean? I don't know. Yeah, I cannot imagine the administrative nightmare that must be, especially being a cell church. So it's like a church of home groups, so to speak, just to try to make it relatable. Korea, and I would say all these other countries as well that we've talked about, are also home to many Western denominations. And so I remember studying church history a long, long, long time ago, and there's this tiny little denomination from North Carolina that came out of the Second Great Awakening. And in my mind, it was just a blip on the radar, and that was it. And then I met a Korean colleague of mine, and he mentioned the denomination he's from, and I said, wait a minute, the one from the Second Great Awakening? He goes, yeah. So it made it all the way to Korea, and it's one of the most popular denominations there. So it's pretty much dead, and I can't even remember the name, but if I said it, you wouldn't probably recognize it. It's quite popular there. So some of the challenges that they listed were limited experience, limited financial resources, greater scrutiny for visas. So as these churches try to send people overseas, they don't have, a lot of them are coming from very small areas that don't have the diversity that a city like Houston has. So they're not used to interacting cross-culturally and understanding things. I heard about this Korean guy who wanted to go to Pakistan and start a noodle house. Okay, which sounds fine, but there's pork in the noodles, and so he didn't understand that in Muslim countries they don't eat pork, and his response was, well, they just haven't tried it yet. Maybe they'll like it. A lot of these global movements, they're making similar mistakes that the Western colonial era missionaries made in terms of importing their culture with the gospel. And so there were people with us in the Middle East who were bringing in, their own rice. And arguably, Egyptian rice is terrible. My wife says I'm a rice snob, but I did grow up Cajun, and so we eat good rice. But, you can see where many of the churches are making very similar mistakes to the ones that Western missionaries have made and still make today. But a lot of times there's greater scrutiny for visas, especially as these people from different countries are going to more developed countries. They always want to try to figure out, well, what are you doing here? When are you leaving? Are you coming to stay and take over? And so depending, even our country, we have greater scrutiny. I don't know if you're aware of this, but depending on where you are from in the world will determine how quickly you can get a green card here, how quickly you can get status here. And so, that can be a very convoluted process depending on which country you're from. And then finally, language and culture acquisition. So we have a lot of resources for that in places that are massive global cities that speak lots of different languages. We have many opportunities to study other languages that they don't have in other places. Some of the advantages then, and these are just across the board, I would say, as global South missionaries go throughout the world, this contradicts the sort of the norm that Christianity is this white thing. Because it's not. Jesus was not white. He was Jewish. He was from the Middle East. And so at some point, it just became understood that Europe and America are the holder to the keys of the kingdom. And the reality is we're not. We never have been. And we're certainly not now. And so as missionaries from Brazil are working with missionaries from Korea and from Nigeria and from India and all these different places, where they go, they're getting this very multi-ethnic picture of look at the nations working together. And where our country might have a fairly dicey history with other countries, chances are if you're from Brazil or the Philippines or Korea, you probably don't have the same diciness that we have. Another thing is they often go from a near culture. And so many of the missionaries, our culture is very individualistic. So when we go to a communal culture, that's a big switch for us. But for a lot of people, if you're coming from Mexico or from Brazil, those are both communal cultures. You go to the Middle East, also a communal culture. Now, culture shock still takes place, but it's sometimes a much closer cultural step. A lot of people throughout the world are multilingual. And so many people, by the time they get to Europe or to the Americas, might speak 2, 3, I've met a lot of people in Houston speak 4 or 5 languages. And so they speak probably like a tribal tongue that their mom used to speak. They might speak their national language or maybe 2 national languages. Then they might have learned French or English also to go to school or to travel abroad. And so often the advantages that Global South missionaries bring is that they have learned, the ones who have had the access to get out and to experience more, a lot of times their language and cultural acquisition skills are much greater than that of Western missionaries. And then finally, they can go places that Western missionaries can't go. Even if they're doing business as mission, they can get jobs that we can't get. So there's tons of Filipinos that are getting jobs as housekeepers throughout the Middle East. Try doing that as a white person. You're not going to get a visa, and you're probably going to get escorted out really, really quickly because they go, this is not something that Americans do. And it's not. So they're not wrong to be suspicious, but imagine the access you have to a family, to a particular family, if you're a nanny or a housekeeper or a private tutor. And so they're able to get a lot of jobs and go to a lot of different places that we can't go. Does anyone have any questions? Tony?
In your earlier slides, you mentioned that Missio Dei kind of was separated at a certain point from Western Christendom. There was like a handshake or a brotherhood kind of a thing. How did that separation come about?
So I think that separation came, I mean, there are other factors. So I'm describing this in missiological terms, but there's definitely political factors, right? So we went from colonialism to post-colonialism. And so there's kind of this often dramatic separation with Western political powers or even Christian entities that happened in these various countries. And so I would say a lot of this has come as a result of that separation. And now the partnerships and kind of the handshakes that are developing across these boundaries are more initiated in both directions.
Would you include the fall of the Roman Empire, separation of church and state, those kinds of things contributing to that?
The fall of the Roman Empire?
Yeah.
We're speaking like that's much earlier.
No, I mean the Holy Roman Empire.
Okay. Possibly.
That shift, what contributed to that?
Yeah, so for Catholic missions, so a lot of what I've been describing has been more from the Protestant side. For Catholic missions, and I think Ming talked about this, the kind of challenge there is all of the Catholic churches are under the Pope. And so even in modern China, to have a group of people that seem to be loyal to an outside authority feels a little bit dangerous to them, which is why they have their own Pope or council or something. Some way of mediating this so that there's definitely some fear there. Look, we had the same thing. When President Kennedy was being elected, a lot of people were afraid that he would be answering to, Rome rather than us. No. So I think in each country there are different factors as to how that story has gone. But I would say a lot of places where I go and I hear from other leaders throughout the world, what they are talking about is we still need partnership with the outside church. Don't just leave us and don't do anything. Don't come in and rule us again. We don't want that. But don't just ignore us either. So any other questions?
All of this that you've been addressing, this is Catholicism and Protestantism, all these, the figures that you're getting? Is the Catholic Church mixed in with the number of missionaries and churches and all that?
I don't believe so. I would have to go back and check the study I got that from. I don't think it was. I know which school put it out, and I don't think that's their. And I don't think they would include, Mormon missionaries or other kind of things. I think they're speaking of evangelical missionaries.
How is this interacting with Orthodox, Eastern mysteries, and Coptics?
Say that again?
How is the Western Church and Roman Catholicism and Protestantism interacting now with Orthodox faith, Eastern mysteries, and the Coptic Church?
I would say largely they're staying separate. And so with the Coptic Church, Eastern Orthodox, et cetera, those denominations have a very strong tie to their national identity. So for instance, you have Eastern Orthodox in Romania, and you also have Romanian Baptists. So Romanian Baptists are very interested in outside Baptists coming in and helping. My parents take a trip to Romania, it seems like every other year or so, and they work with the church there. But the Baptist church, even the Romanian Baptist church, is at odds with the Orthodox church, which have used them to be heretics and is trying to kind of stamp them out politely. So even within, forget the outside question, just within a particular country in general, in Egypt, the Coptic church and the evangelical church typically don't get along that well. And then that just gets exacerbated when you talk about outsiders. Okay, we're going to take